So I'd like to welcome everyone to this edition of the Priestley Lecture Series at the University of Lethbridge. I'm Kent Peacock from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Lethbridge, and my guest is Professor Steven Pinker. Just as we now have the Public Professor at Home series, this will be a Priestley event at home. Professor Pinker was to come to the University of Lethbridge this fall and give a guest lecture, or in fact two, but his visit had to be put on hold by the pandemic. We hope to reschedule the event for sometime next year, but in the meantime, Professor Pinker has generously agreed to give a Zoom interview to help us fill the gap. Let me give a very short version of Professor Pinker's impressive vita. He was born in Montreal, earned his first degree from Dawson College in Montreal, and eventually a PhD in experimental psychology at Harvard University, where he is now Johnstone Family Professor in the Department of Psychology. He has an enormous list of publications, including 10 books. He describes himself on his website as, quote, an experimental psychologist who is interested in all aspects of language and mind. But he is not merely a highly accomplished academic psychologist and linguist. He has established himself as one of the foremost public intellectuals of our time. He has won numerous awards for his writing, and among his many honors, he is listed among Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world today. Steven Pinker, welcome, virtually at least, to Lethbridge, Alberta. So I put together a few hopefully provocative questions to spark our conversation. And if you're all right with that, I'll just throw you the first question. So in 2018, you published a book entitled Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. And by the way, I'm very pleased to note the use of the Oxford comma in the title. In this book, and indeed in much of your work, you argue that science, rationality, and humanism can engender genuine progress toward a better world. Has the coronavirus crisis and the way that governments around the world have responded to it shaken this optimism? As we speak, the crisis is far from over. Is there anything you'd like to see done that could improve humanity's chances of getting through this thing and perhaps even learning something from it?
Yeah, I resist the characterization of Enlightenment Now as a book on optimism. It's really a book on progress and its causes, which is different. Optimism doesn't refers to an attitude. Progress is a fact. Namely, that if you go by actual data gathered at different times in history, not by the headlines, because remember, headlines are a non-random sample of the worst things happening on Earth at any time. But if you look at not only today's calamities, but yesterday's calamities, you see yesterday's calamities were worse. And that includes pandemics. Disease is a part of the human condition. It's a part of the condition of living things. You and I are big, yummy hunks of chocolate cake as far as a germ is concerned. We're just there waiting to be eaten. And life is a struggle between organisms and the germs that want to eat them from the inside. That's why we have immune systems. That's probably why we have sex. And the disease has always been the limiting factor on the human population. It's why we never expand to overconsume resources in our environment. We get sick first and get felled by diseases. It's why disease in almost all wars kills more soldiers than bullets. And it's why there have been periodic global pandemics in centuries past. So we shouldn't think of the current pandemic as some weird anomaly. It's more the rule than the exception. The difference is that we now have the tools to deal with it that our ancestors did not. As soon as it emerged, we knew that there was a pathogen, a virus. We knew it wasn't evil spirits. We knew it wasn't the Jews poisoning the wells. We knew it wasn't foul-smelling air. At least most of us did. Granted, there are always conspiracy theories and crazy beliefs. The genetic sequence was established within 2 weeks. There are vaccines that are being tested now. The death toll and the economic toll are both horrific. But there's every reason to believe that it will be brought under control far faster than pandemics in the past. And this is also acknowledging that a lot of governments, not least the one of my adopted country, have criminally mishandled it. And perhaps not coincidentally, I'll try to wrap up this answer. The administration of Donald Trump and authoritarian populist movements in general are kind of the unenlightenment or counter-enlightenment political platforms. If the themes that I emphasized in Enlightenment Now that were responsible for progress, namely humanism and reason and science, those are the drivers of progress. In many ways, the populist and reactionary and nationalist movements are the exact opposite. Going back to counter-enlightenment movements of the 19th century, they are nationalist and ethnocentric and racialist as opposed to humanist, that is prioritizing human well-being. They're backward-looking, make America great again, as opposed to believing in progress, and they are rather notoriously cool to hostile to science.
Second part of my question, is there anything we could be doing now that, I mean, what should we be learning from this?
Well, we should treat pandemics the way we treat fires. Namely, we've got fire departments where they've been so successful at dealing with fires that most of them are putting themselves out of business. The firefighters, they kind of spend a lot of time sitting around with their Dalmatians and waiting for the bell to ring or chopping down doors for heart attack victims. But the rate of fires and deaths in fires has come down precisely because we lavish funds on preventing something that fortunately no longer happens that much. We should do the same with pandemics. We should have been prepared. We should. This is something that experts had been warning us about, that they can happen. They can be devastating. We should have early reporting networks in place. We should have measures that we're ready to implement, personal protective equipment, vaccine manufacturing capacity, increased investment in antiviral technologies. Even if in many years they aren't put to use, it's good to have them for the same reason it's good to have fire departments.
I mean, one of the things I work on a lot is issues around climate change and global warming. And there's people, I'm sure you've heard this, who've said things like, oh, human beings aren't wired to deal with as big such a huge problem as climate change. We're wired to deal with sort of more local social pressures and immediate problem solving and, you know, making sure your roof doesn't leak and that kind of thing. But we're just not wired to handle which I guess means organize socially on a large enough scale to adequately deal with these sort of global scale challenges. Do you buy that? I mean, as a evolutionary psychologist, do you buy that? Or?
Well, yeah. So I have. I mean, this is the tension between the rather limited capacities and temperaments of human nature and the potential for progress is what's been driven three of my books: The Blank Slate on the Modern Denial of Human Nature, The Better Angels of Our Nature on the Decline of Violence, and Enlightenment Now. And it's true, we're not wired for it. On the other hand, even though I am an evolutionary psychologist, and I do believe, you know, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing can be made, as Immanuel Kant famously said, our minds are limited, our concerns are limited. On the other hand, I'm also a cognitive scientist, and one of the parts of human nature is reason connected to language, both of which are open-ended combinatorial systems. We aren't just stuck with a finite list of ideas, but we can combine them. Just as we combine words into sentences, we can combine ideas into formulas and algorithms and recipes and theories built out of other theories. And there's a rule system, an open-ended algorithm can have infinite scope, even though it's built out of a finite set of operations. And just as our Stone Age brains still have managed to invent things like, you know, computers and internet over which we're conversing now, that's certainly not part of human nature. It comes when we collectively implement institutions and rules and feedback channels and ways of accumulating information that make us collectively smarter than any one of us is individually. So yeah, none of us could solve climate change. Is it impossible that we could wrap our minds around the inevitability of disaster if we don't do anything? And is it inevitable that we can't grasp the possibility of coming up with technologies and policies that would mitigate it? I think it's an uphill climb, but I don't think it's impossible. Just as we got to the moon, we outlawed slavery. We've actually so far managed to prevent a third world war. We've prevented nuclear war since Nagasaki. The second bomb so far has been the last one. We've done all kinds of things that you wouldn't credit a single mind to be able to do, and indeed a single mind couldn't do it. But as we pool our ingenuity, pool the results of our successful and failed experiments, we can, I think it's within our capacity to deal with challenges like that.
It reminds me, what you're saying is reminds me of something the historian Stephen Snyder said, which I thought was probably right. As he said in his book on tyranny, and how do we prevent the uprise of tyranny again? And he said one of the most important things is protect your institutions, right? And you can see this in, well, Trump, Hitler, or many other of these autocrats or would-be autocrats, that they attack the institutions and the legal institutions, the democratic institutions, the scientific institutions.
I couldn't agree more. That's exactly right. And that's the answer to the question, or the resolution of the paradox of is how with our puny primate Stone Age brains did we manage to do things like get to the moon? And the answer is it's our institutions that somehow, with the right rules, checks and balances, measures that prevent a single ego from imposing his will, peer review in science, elections and constitutional limits in democracies, editing in Wikipedia pages, ways in which no single person gets to impose his or her will on the whole collective, but there are feedback channels so that even if someone has some idiotic idea, someone else will have a better idea and will be able to squelch it. It's a constant struggle, and it's the institutions that do it. And absolutely, the tyrants know that and have to impose their personal will. They've got to dismantle the institutions.
Yeah, so you see Trump attacking the judicial process itself, attacking the laws, and but again, this reminds me of something that Thomas Homer Dixon has made I thought a very good distinction between what he called, there's technological ingenuity, making the transistors and all those other things, but there's also what Homer Dixon calls social ingenuity, which is our capacity to create appropriate institutions as well. And it looks like, in a sense, that's just as important as the technological side.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I think the brainchildren of the Enlightenment were both the scientific theories that allowed us to transform the world and institutions that are very much gadgets that overcome our limitations. Markets, democratic governance, bills of rights, peer review in scientific societies, a free press. All of those are indeed, as you and Homer Dixon point out, they're kind of gadgets, those institutions. And in many cases, such as in the formulation of the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution, they're kind of hashed out as solutions to problems. What do you do about the constant temptation of the machinery of government being taken over by some psychopath? Now, of course, we now know that the solution to the problem they came up with wasn't bad for the 18th century, but it's got some bugs in it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like a computer program. Any of these things can be buggy, and you've got to keep on producing better versions of them all the time. Yeah, although I guess the difference is with the computer program, it always has a very, very clearly definable goal. It's doing your income tax or something, right? And if it doesn't work, But the trouble is, people can disagree about whether or not, say, our Constitution is actually doing what it should be doing. So there's a question of values too, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why the subtitle of Enlightenment now was The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, where humanism was absolutely crucial, because just reason and science by themselves could be put to any nefarious use. Humanism, which sounds kind of banal and obvious, human well-being, making people healthy and happy and prosperous and stimulated. It sounds like a kind of who could be against that? It's like being against motherhood. But in fact, you're right. They're their values, and they're not the only values. Their national glory is another value. Religious law and scripture is another value. Deference to authority, universal conformity. Those are all values that are not the same as human flourishing. And it's, fortunately, when you put it to people, do you think that it's better that people are healthy than sick? You don't get too many people who disagree. Better people that are free than are enslaved, peace better than war. As long as you concentrate the mind on those values that at the end of the day, most people would not disagree with. And then you measure the relative success of our institutions, like constitutional government, against their ability to realize those values. That's the kind of debugging that you were talking about. Namely, that's kind of when you know that something is not going well. And certainly we see lots of signs of that more in the United States than in Canada. But the United States underperforms countries of the same prosperity. Americans don't live as long. We have a higher rate of crime, higher rate of suicide, higher rate of unhappiness, higher rate of obesity, drug abuse, functional illiteracy, you name it. And we're not bad as far as the 193 nations of the world are concerned, but we're not number one. And Canada is better than the US in all of these measures, which is a kind of signal that that there's some bugs in the American system.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that Timothy Snyder had in New York Review of Books recently, where he was literally comparing Trump to an opioid. So he points out that states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, which swung to Trump in 2016, are also states where the opioid crisis is very severe. And then you say, well, how could Trump just does one outrageous thing after the other? And why can't his followers see that? And Snyder's suggestion was, well, to them, he's a drug. They're addicted to him. And I don't know how serious a comparison that was, but it was an interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah. But now I had a couple other questions here. Now this sort of follows up kind of on what we've just been talking about. And again, something that I paid a lot of attention to because of my interest in climate issues. But so one thing that characterizes the social and political movements of our time, especially so-called populism, or false populism might be a better term, is the indulgence in denial. So denial of climate change, denial of racism, denial of sexism, denial of economic inequality, and denial of advice from professionals and experts. And it's almost as if what somebody like Trump is peddling is denial itself. Follow me, and then you can deny anything you want. And do you think that's an accurate analysis? And if so, what can we do about that? I mean,
yeah, it connects to several of the topics we've been discussing. Certainly, part of populism is the kind of the vesting of power and wisdom in a charismatic leader who voices the interests of the people directly, as opposed to the idea that we only make progress by institutions. None of us is smart or wise enough to implement any policy that's going to work, and it's the rules of the game that determine whether they work. It's not that the experts are geniuses. It's just that they submit themselves to peer review. And if they say something stupid, someone else will show that it's stupid in the whole system.
Well, also the experts are highly trained. I mean, I'd rather have heart surgery from a highly trained heart surgeon than, somebody who just guesses something might work, so.
And of course, the training is training in the right stuff. You don't want a highly trained astrologer or someone highly trained in homeopathy. What they're highly trained in is something that we have every reason to believe is accurate and healthy. So yes, absolutely. So it can't just be, the thing is that if it's just, there's a high priesthood of experts and let's do what they say, that's not the idea. It's that the reason that we respect experts is that they have proven their expertise. It's an open book. We can see where they got their training. We can see why they made their claims. We know that experts sometimes get things wrong, but that's what we should expect because our natural state is ignorance. And it's amazing that we know anything about anything. Making mistakes and correcting them is how we acquire knowledge. I mean, that's almost any scientist would say that the essence of science is that you state hypotheses in a form they can be falsified, and you stick with the ones that survive. It's the commission of errors, but crucially, the mechanism of correcting errors that allows experts to earn their trust. And alternatives, all the alternatives work worse.
So how do we defend that idea? I mean, against the flat earthers or the Trump followers, and these, how do we defend that idea?
Part of it is we've got to kind of pry the overall mindset of science and reason from political tribes, including academics' own political tribe, which almost exclusively is the political left. So when climate change becomes seen as a left-wing issue, the people on the right will say, well, whatever that is, we're not going to believe it. And I think there is a rather dangerous polarization within academia. The people, outsiders, actually think that experts from academia are just another tribe. We've got our Republican Party, and they've got their, the academic establishment, a science tribe. So science can't be seen as a tribe. It has to be following rules that anyone can understand. And as a result, academia should avoid some of the signaling and demonization of non-leftists that lead people to think of academia as just another political faction. It should be diversity of viewpoint, not just diversity of skin color and genitals. The rules of the game that say ideas are evaluated by their merits, not who advocates them, should be one that we flaunt in order to earn the trust that experts need.
Yeah, I mean, climate denial is a very, very interesting case study of just what you're talking about, and certainly that's what I've encountered is just this idea. Oh, they're just another tribe, the scientist tribe, and they all just say the right things and they rub blue mud in their navels in exactly the right way, and nobody sees that. If a scientist says that carbon dioxide levels are dangerously high in a certain specific sense, that's not just a statement of allegiance. It's there's cognitive evidence for it. Yeah.
Indeed, and you're probably aware of the work by Dan Kahan at Yale, that people who accept the scientific consensus on climate change, by and large, no more scientifically literate than those who deny it. There are a lot of people who are what you and I would say are on the right side of the issue, think that climate change comes from the ozone hole, and the way to deal with it is to clean up toxic waste dumps. And I mean, they're out to lunch when it comes to climate science, but they end up on the right side just because they're on the side of what they think of as the side of general green, pro-science, pro-ecology. The real danger is that when climate is seen as a left-wing issue, or people on the left, the good news is they accept it. The bad news is the people on the right will deny it. Neither of them necessarily grasping the scientific evidence. It's sometimes been said that what we need is to recruit more conspicuous libertarian and right-wing figures who accept the scientific consensus. I mean, the sad fact being that they have diminished, but probably the smarter among them can't deny the scientific reality forever. And as they start to peel away, as some have, Ronald Bailey, a well-known libertarian science journalist, has, I think, shifted in acknowledging anthropogenic climate change. But people who are not flaming left-wingers have to be recruited in order to show that this really is not an issue of political tribalism, or it shouldn't be.
So I've got a slightly different question. It's a little bit more theoretical, but it still connects with the kinds of things we've been talking about. So one of the things that's always fascinated me is creativity, human creativity. And there's a wonderful example I like to use just to bring up the point. So there's a wonderful book by Brian Fagan, who's a paleoanthropologist, on the Cro-Magnon peoples. And he describes how perhaps 30,000 years ago, we're not exactly sure, the so-called Magdalenian people in Europe discovered or invented the first sewing needles. And he said this is actually a very important technological innovation because they are in Ice Age Europe, they're in subarctic climate, and being able to make clothing that fits is actually an important survival tool. And but the thing that's fascinating to me is that ingenious human beings have been around for a heck of a lot longer than 30,000 years. And yet at a certain point, before a certain point, there's no sewing needle. And then we have the sewing needle. And as a philosopher, what fascinates me is just, it's a new thing, that creativity has this capacity. It's almost like somewhat similar in its function to biological mutation. It could introduce a new thing. Suddenly you have a technological capacity you didn't have before. And it's a fascinating thing. So what's, maybe the first question is, what's behind creativity? I mean, you're a neuroscientist and you've thought a great deal about this or some related issues. What's behind creativity and what can be done to encourage it, especially at times when we really need it?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a profound and fascinating question. And why 30,000 years ago, given that as far as we know, there wasn't any biological change around that time. I mean, one theory from Raymond Klein is that there was a biological change around 70,000 years ago. And I think that's starting to fall out of favor. Part of the answer of just the first question, why then, it may have to do with increasing population density. That is, useful creative inventions are rare and precious things. And first of all, you need just lots and lots and lots of brains trying them out to increase the probability that someone will find something that works. And that you probably also need a network of people that are sharing bits of solutions to a problem that can then be agglomerated, be aggregated. And there's reason to think from the history of ideas, history of technology, history of civilization, that what leads to advancement is a huge catchment area of ideas that can be combined. This was the theme of Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, why Eurasia, Europe in particular, conquered the Americas and Africa and large parts of Asia, not the other way around. Thomas Sowell came up with the idea actually before Diamond, that Eurasia just being so huge and with such easy pathways of transportation east to west and with rivers and without major barriers, that ideas that originate from far-flung areas could be combined. That one idea is never, even the sewing needle, and I don't know if the archaeological record supports any kind of predecessors or intermediate steps, but a sewing needle needs, so it needs a lot of things. You have to make a sharp point, you've got to have the idea of the eye, it's got to be stiff, there's got to be some kind of thread. It's even possible that those originated and had to, in different places, and had to be combined. There's a reason that we use the word provincial or parochial to refer to something that's primitive, namely something, or insular, things that are too isolated. Even if they have their genius or two, you need lots of geniuses combining their ideas to get something that's truly useful and that endures. But going back to your even bigger question, what is creativity? I kind of struggled with this in my book, The Stuff of Thought. And it seems to me cognitively there are two ingredients. One of them was one that we brought up earlier in the conversation. That's combinatorics. The mental capacity emphasized by Noam Chomsky in language, by the pioneers in cognitive science and artificial intelligence like George Miller and Alan Newell and Herb Simon and Marvin Minsky in the realm of ideas, namely algorithms that allow you to combine simple ideas into bigger assemblies, to have each assembly itself be a chunk that itself can be combined with other assemblies, and to build bigger and bigger intellectual contraptions out of originally a smaller inventory of basic ideas. Recursion, absolutely, it is recursion, exactly. And the other component, I think, is analogy, that we can have an idea about some concrete process, an object being at a place, an agent exerting force on an object causing it to move. We can kind of bleach out the particulars and have a more abstract formula or schema, like we can analogize change of position to change of state, and say something like the temperature went from hot to cold, where nothing actually went anywhere, but we're using the same mental apparatus for motion for change of state. Or this is a compelling idea. You're forced, the evidence forces you to believe something. Now, there's no actual oomph or physical force, but we abstract the general idea of causation of a change from presumably something we evolved with, that is actually pushing something or getting up and moving. And that can be done at multiple levels. So we can understand the atom as analogous to a solar system, or the genes to a coded message, or the immune system antibodies to a lock and key. And analogy, I think, is the other part of the puzzle of how a mind that presumably evolved to deal with mundane physical challenges like food and health and safety, and managed to come up with philosophy and science and law and all the rest.
There's a nice book by Edward de Bono called The Mechanism of Mind, and where he's basically talking about how does creative problem solving work. And his sort of catchphrase is, the mind is a good computer because it's a bad memory. And what he means by this is, we don't just combine ideas like pieces of a Meccano set. We morph them, right? So you're seeing, you have experience of all these different things, and you kind of blend them together. So one thing, sort of a horse turns into a bird or something like that in your mind. And he suggests that's, so I mean, if you read some of the 18th century people like Hume, it's a very combinatorial model of how people think. They just manipulate pieces of stuff until it's like doing Rubik's Cube or something, until it clicks together, just the right way. But obviously that does go on, but de Bono's suggestions, we also morph it. We change the topology. We just change the shape of things. And does that jibe with anything in neuroscience? Does that make sense? Or
yes, I mean, I think neuroscience may be too fine-grained molecular level, but certainly cognitive science, which is kind of an abstraction from neuroscience. But yeah, we alter ideas sometimes by just misremembering them, by the cognitive equivalent of a mutation in biology. But more often, one thing reminds us of another, so we take it out of one context and bring it into another, like say a market being analogized to an ecosystem, or the idea, Darwin taking Thomas Malthus's idea of overpopulation, population increasing geometrically, and applying it to ecosystems and evolving animals. Yeah, we don't just regurgitate ideas. We abstract analogies and we combine them. And I think those are the two engines of creativity.
yeah, getting back to the social side of it, if you go back to when somebody invented the sewing needle, 25, 35,000 years ago, or whenever it was, we know virtually nothing about social conditions at that time. But I think you can say it must have been possible. People must have been allowed to think of something like that. I mean, so somebody could say, well, hey, what if we had a better way of joining two pieces of fabric together? That wasn't considered to be a crazy and heretical thought. They weren't immediately put in the, on the fire for thinking that. They were allowed to think about it. And that's got to be a part of the story too, don't you think?
Absolutely. And we have every reason to think that different societies in different periods of history were more or less receptive to change, to new ideas, to improvement. A new recent book by Johann Norberg called Open talks about how the expansive, creative, successful societies were those that opened themselves up to new ideas, both internally and crucially externally, because no society in itself has enough geniuses to come up with these ideas. So you have to, so it's another similar saying to the one about mathematicians that good artists copy, great artists steal. I think it's been attributed. So you need to have a lot of ideas to steal from as well.
Look, I have the feeling we could talk all afternoon but we'll have to wrap this up. We're very, very grateful for you to doing this with us. And, Catherine will get back to us with, a draft for approval and all that sort of thing. And best of health to you and your family and everybody. And just, hope we'll, those vaccines are out soon or something or whatever's going to happen. And we'll go from there. So thank you very, very much.
So thank you very much, Kent.